This is lecture 18C. I'm going to turn now to South America. I've been talking about the Aztecs up in Mexico, and now I'm going to turn to the Inca Empire, which emerged in South America. The Inca Empire was really founded by a man named Pachacuti, who ruled from 1438 to 1471. And he was a really energetic, dynamic guy. And the Incas were originally just sort of a migrant people who lived in the highlands of the Andes, and they settled around Lake Titicaca. But they began under Pachacuti a series of conquests, and they were very good at, once they conquered one people, using those resources and particular manpower to go conquer more people. And so Pachacuti led a whole series of conquests over the course of the early part of his reign that really expanded the Inca Empire, and it became the biggest empire that South America has ever really seen. The Inca Empire stretched from Quito, Ecuador in the north, all the way down to Santiago, Chile in the south. So it included Peru and Ecuador and Chile, but it also included parts of Bolivia and Argentina on the other side of the Andes Mountains. So it's a really long, narrow empire because it's sort of stuck between the Andes Mountains and the ocean. Although, as I said, it did get over the Andes Mountains a little bit into Bolivia and Argentina. But essentially, it's a long, thin empire. And initially, the Incas were up in the highlands. They were up in the Andes Mountains. And they gradually, Pachacuti conquered a bunch of people up in the highlands, and then he turned to try to conquering an empire called the Chimu Empire down on the lowlands by the ocean. And the Chimu had much bigger population, and it was wealthier, so you wouldn't think Pachacuti could conquer it, but he controlled the highlands, and he realized that he controlled the water because the irrigation systems they needed for agriculture down in the flat lowlands came from the highlands, from the mountains, and Pachacuti could control that. So he actually managed to bring them to submit, and he created this enormous empire. It probably had about 11.5 million people in it, although some more conservative estimates put it maybe 9 million. But it was a huge empire. And so once he's established his empire, Pachacuti actually, he put one of his sons in charge of military affairs, and he retired to the city of Cusco, which he turned into sort of an amazing capital city with these temples and big open plazas and things like that. And he then set about sort of creating a stable empire, and he did this a number of ways. One is he built a lot of roads for communication. This is a long, narrow empire, so it's a long distance from the north to the south, and a lot of the population is up in the highlands. It's in the mountains, right? And so communications are difficult. Now down in the lowlands, you got the ocean. You use boats, etc. But up in the highlands, you need communication. So he built a series of roads that were really kind of astonishing because they go right through the mountains. And the Incas never had wheeled vehicles. There's some evidence they had wheeled toys for kids, so they knew what a wheel was. But because they lived in such mountainous terrain, they never really saw the wheel as much use. And so instead, what they used for trade was llamas and alpacas, which are pack animals. And they are really sure-footed, and they handle hills, etc. well. So a lot of the Inca roads actually had staircases built into them going up the sides of mountains and things like that. But they fostered communications, and they allowed the Inca the central government to maintain control of the Inca Empire as a whole. And the Inca Empire, far more than the Aztecs, had a vision of empire that involves this tight control of the population. Now the Aztecs, as I said, they would conquer a city and they'd say, you run your own affairs, as long as you send tribute to us once a year, we're good with it. And so the Aztecs really didn't care what people were doing in their empire, and they really didn't monitor people, or they just took tribute and said, as long as we get our tribute, we're fine. If we don't get our tribute, we're coming down on you like a ton of bricks. The Incas took the opposite approach. They wanted to control everything, right? The Incas actually, in terms of trade, the government controlled all long-distance trade. And so they didn't allow any independent merchants. There was no free trade system. The government instead would requisition a whole bunch of jewelry from this area and then sell it over here, and the government would requisition a bunch of grain from this area and sell it over there, and they would requisition a bunch of textiles from this area and sell it over there. And so you had this sort of a local economy that really, it seemed to just run on barter as people traded for things. But any trade beyond the local area, the government did manage the trade. So it was government officials handling all the trade. So it was really almost like a controlled, central planned economy in a sense. And so trade was dominated by the government, but agriculture was as well. What they basically did is they broke the civilization up into these small little villages. They would assign a group of families to a small village, and they would grow their own food, and they would basically, they could do what they wanted in their small village, and they didn't actually have to pay taxes. Whatever they grew on their land, they got to keep. Whatever they made themselves, they got to keep. But they had to periodically work on government land. And so a significant chunk of land was owned by big aristocrats or the government. And the big aristocrats were often bureaucrats in the government. It was hard to separate that. But they would own these huge tracts of land, and all the peasants were required to give a certain amount of labor on that land. And then the land, whatever that land produced, either went to the individual aristocrats, or it went into government coffers, or it went into government storehouses. And so in that sense, the agricultural system was also sort of in large part centrally planned, although individual peasants had their own little plots of land, their own small farms, but significant chunk of the agriculture was owned by the government, planned by the government, and maintained by the ruling classes. There was also, the Incas had a slightly different religion. Like all the other religions in the Americas, it involved sacrifice, but it generally did not involve human sacrifice. The Incas only practiced human sacrifice in extremely desperate situations like droughts or massive plagues or things like that. Instead, the regular sacrifices they made were usually of animals, llamas or alpacas, or even just agricultural produce that they would offer to the gods. But what's interesting about the Inca religion is that it also began to develop a sense of personal morality. That they taught that individuals have to fulfill their, do everything right in society. And if they transgress, murder or rape or theft or whatever, they're actually destabilizing the order of the universe. And so each individual has to sort of maintain the order of the universe, and they had an idea of an afterlife where you would be punished for bad behavior. So they're developing a religion that's not too far off. It sort of functions in a similar way to Hinduism, this idea that you have to do your duty to maintain the order of the universe, and you will be rewarded or punished in the next life. Or sort of like Christianity, that God wants you to just do your part and you'll be rewarded with happiness in the afterlife. So the Inca religion functions that way, and in fact, they even had priests that you would do confessions to. Now, the Inca religion did focus on a couple of big gods. There was a sun god, Inti, and then there was a god of who had created the physical world, Viracocha, and so they had ceremonies and offerings to those gods, and so it was an interesting sort of hybrid in that some of it was like our old transactional religions, where you had a priestly class making sacrifices to give the gods to keep them happy, and part of it is more like these personal morality religions like Hinduism or Christianity, where each individual's personal moral choices mattered for the whole of society. So overall, the Inca Empire was a huge sprawling empire with a really highly developed sense of government control, as they had this sort of centrally controlled economy, centrally controlled trade, centrally controlled agriculture. But one of the interesting things about this is that the Inca Empire did all of this without a system of writing. They did not ever develop a writing system. The Aztecs had a writing system, and we've seen all the other civilizations develop a writing system. The Incas did not develop a writing system. Well, you might say, well, how do they keep track of everything? What they had was actually an interesting little device called a quipu, Q-U-I-P-U. And what the quipu was it would be like a string of beads, or maybe a ring, and it would have strings coming off of it, and those strings would have beads on them. And what they would do is they would add or subtract beads to remember it was a memory device. So like this string represented how much this village owed every year in, or in labor, and so they would add or subtract beads based on how much that village owed. And the quipu allowed them to keep track of whole, enormous amounts of information, but it required that somebody have memorized what each item on that quipu was, and so that they can remember what those beads represent. And it required that if that person gets sick or dies, you have to have somebody else who knows too, because once the person who understands it dies, then the quipu is useless if nobody else knows what those things mean. Right? So the quipu is not a perfect device. It was not as good as written records, but it was enough to allow the Incas to keep really incredible amounts of information about their economies, about their trade, about their production, agricultural production, etc., and to manage this huge empire. Right? And so overall then, on the eve of Christopher Columbus showing up and then the Spanish conquering all of this, there were two big empires in the Americas. There was the Aztecs up in modern-day Mexico, and there were the Incas in modern-day Peru, Ecuador, Chile, etc. And both of them were large empires. The Aztecs, as I said, were 20-some million, maybe 21 million, and the Incas were probably 11, at least 9. Some people go as high as 12 million. Those are sizable empires. And so we'll see what happens. If you take History 112, you'll find out what happens to these empires. But in the discussion for today, I want to look ahead a little bit at the conquest of these empires. And I just want to return to Jared Diamond's thesis about guns, germs, and steel, but we'll do that in the discussion.